Imagine you are sitting inside what the world considers to be the finest vehicle money can buy. The upholstery is deep burgundy velvet. The woodwork is lacquered to a mirror finish. The family crest is painted on the door in gold and crimson, perfectly centered, freshly touched up that very morning. The match pair of horses outside have been brushed until their coats catch the pale London light. Your coachman wears full livery. Your footman stands at the rear step in powder and gloves. You are not a beggar. You are not a merchant. You are not someone clinging to respectability with worn fingernails. You are an aristocrat. You are at the very summit of Victorian England, and you are about to have one of the most grueling experiences that civilization has ever devised, because the carriage is about to move. This is 1880. London is the capital of the largest empire the world has ever known. 5 million people press against each other in its streets, its courts of law, its markets, its mews, its slums. The city is the beating heart of global finance, of naval power, of scientific ambition, of literary genius, of moral authority, or at least moral performance, which in Victorian England amounts to very nearly the same thing. Queen Victoria has been on the throne for 43 years. The British Empire controls a quarter of the Earth's surface, and every single day in the grandest neighborhoods of the city that rules this empire, something happens that no diplomat, no general, no journalist ever fully conveys to the outside world. The nobility climb into their carriages, and then everything begins to go wrong. Not visibly wrong, not dramatically wrong, not wrong in any way that would register on a face trained from birth to register nothing, but wrong in 10 simultaneous directions that accumulate over the course of a single afternoon into an experience so thoroughly unpleasant that it is a marvel anyone chose to do it at all, and yet they chose it every single day. Because in 1880, they had almost no choice. To be seen in your carriage was not a leisure activity. It was a professional obligation. It was a social duty enforced by 1,000 invisible rules, watched by 1,000 invisible eyes, and judged by a standard that admitted of no excuse, no exception, and no honest complaint. This is the story of what actually happened when a Victorian aristocrat stepped into that beautiful, expensive, immaculate carriage and tried to get from one side of London to the other. It begins, as most Victorian nightmares do, long before the nightmare itself. The preparation for a carriage ride did not begin when you put on your coat. It began several hours earlier, in the mews behind your townhouse, where a world invisible to polite society was already in full, exhausting motion. The mews were the backcountry of aristocratic life, tucked behind the grand terraced facades of Mayfair and Belgravia, accessible through a separate lane that the residents of the house itself rarely had occasion to enter. Here the horses lived. Here the carriages were stored. Here the coachmen, grooms, and stable boys conducted the enormous labor of keeping wealthy people mobile. And that labor was genuinely enormous. A horse required daily grooming that typically took between 1 and 2 hours per animal. The coat had to be brushed, the mane arranged, the hooves cleaned and checked for stones, loose shoes, or the beginnings of the lameness that could end an animal's usefulness overnight. For a carriage horse expected to perform before an aristocratic household, the standard was higher still. The coat had to gleam. The harness had to fit perfectly, because an ill-fitting collar pressing against a horse's windpipe could cause the animal to stagger, sway, collapse, or bolt without warning. The carriage itself had to be inspected wheel by wheel, spring by spring, bolt by bolt, because a failure in any component at the wrong moment meant not merely inconvenience, but the very real possibility of a serious accident in the middle of one of the most congested streets in the world. This inspection was not paranoid habit. It was hard-won survival instinct. By 1880, London's streets were carrying an almost incomprehensible volume of horse-drawn traffic. Historians who have tried to reconstruct the daily numbers arrive at figures that strain credulity. An estimated 100,000 horses crossed into the city of London alone during a single working day. Across the whole metropolis, working horses may have numbered more than 300,000. Every one of these animals was engaged in some form of transportation, some form of delivery, some form of commercial or domestic service that kept the city functioning. And every single one of these animals was, at regular intervals throughout the day, relieving itself directly onto the streets. By the 1890s, which is close enough to 1880 to be relevant, London's horses were producing approximately 1,000 tons of manure every day. 1,000 tons. The Victorians were aware of this problem. They were also almost entirely unable to solve it. Street sweepers were employed across the city, and crossing sweepers maintained clean paths across the busiest intersections for pedestrians willing to tip them a coin. But the sheer volume of waste defeated every practical effort at removal. The streets of London in 1880, regardless of what they looked like from the outside of a carriage window, were in a condition that would strike a modern observer as both extraordinary and deeply dangerous. Contemporary writers described them as perpetually covered in a dark, glutinous paste of horse dung, horse urine, street dust, coal ash, and rain, which combined into a substance that the Victorians called mud, but which was, in actual composition, something considerably less pleasant. The smell of Victorian London in 1880 was something that no amount of lavender water, pomander, or social pretension could entirely neutralize. A writer of the period described the characteristic summer smell of the city as a cocktail of stale fruit and vegetables, rotten eggs, foul tobacco, spilled beer, rank cart grease, dried soot, road dust, and damp straw. That was one observer's impression on a relatively ordinary day. When the temperature rose, or the rain fell and the manure mud was churned by 10,000 wheels and 40,000 hooves, the effect intensified. When the wind was from the Thames, which was itself still carrying the residue of London's sewage in ways that Bazalgette's new sewer system had only partially addressed, the effect intensified further. And through all of this, in a carriage polished to mirror brightness, the aristocrat would soon have to travel. The coachman, meanwhile, was conducting his final checks with the particular concentration of a man who understood that his employer's dignity, and possibly his employer's physical survival, depended on the quality of his attention. The harness had to be inspected for any crack or fraying in the leather that could, under the tension of two horses suddenly alarmed by a noise or a smell, snap and release the animals from the vehicle entirely. The wheels had to be checked for any looseness in the iron tires that could cause a catastrophic wobble on the uneven stone surfaces of the London streets. The brakes had to be tested. The springs, which were what stood between the passengers and the full percussive shock of cobblestones and road craters, had to be assessed for any sign of weakness. Because in 1880, before the carriage even reached the end of the street, the road itself was already working against it. Victorian London's streets were a patchwork of different paving materials in different states of repair, maintained by different authorities under different standards of competence. Some sections of the major thoroughfares had been laid with granite setts, which provided a firm surface, but was extraordinarily noisy. The iron-shod hooves and iron-rimmed wheels producing a din that contemporary observers described as nearly intolerable. Other sections were paved with macadam, the compressed stone and gravel surface invented by John Loudon Macadam earlier in the century, which was quieter but which wore unevenly under traffic, developing hollows and ruts that caused carriage wheels to lurch unpredictably in ways that threw passengers against the interior walls. Some sections had been experimented upon with wooden blocks, an attempt to reduce noise that had been abandoned in places like Piccadilly after it became clear that the wood absorbed horse urine and produced an ammonia smell so powerful that it was reportedly discoloring nearby shopfronts. This is what the road felt like from inside a well-sprung, expensive carriage in 1880. The springs absorbed some of the shock. They did not absorb all of it. Every hole in the macadam transmitted itself upward through the wheel, through the axle, through the spring, and into the body of the vehicle as a jolt. Not a dramatic jolt. Not a jolt that would knock a book from your hands or a cup from its saucer. but a persistent, irregular, cumulative jolt, arriving at unpredictable intervals as the carriage found each new imperfection in the surface, which meant that the body of the carriage was never fully at rest and the passengers were never fully still. The experience was not violent, but over the course of an hour in London traffic, it was relentless in a way that ground against the nervous system like water dripping on stone, and you were expected to look perfectly composed the entire time. This is the element of the Victorian carriage ride that the historical record tends to understate. The physical discomfort was real, but the social pressure surrounding it was a different kind of ordeal entirely. In Victorian aristocratic society, the carriage was not primarily a means of transportation. It was a public performance. It was the most visible statement a family could make about its wealth, its taste, its status, and its adherence to the unspoken codes that separated those who belonged from those who merely aspired. Every element of the carriage and its equipage was therefore subject to a standard of perfection that admitted no compromise and offered no sympathy. The carriage itself had to be not merely functional, but impeccable. The paint had to be the family color, applied in immaculate condition. The family crest centered exactly on both doors. The hardware had to be polished. The interior had to be maintained in a state of absolute cleanliness that was, given the realities of London's streets, a constant battle against invisible intrusions of dust and ash, and the fine particulate matter that the coal fires of 500,000 London households released into the air above the city every single day. The sheep in Regent's Park, one contemporary noted, could be aged by the darkness of their wool, which went from white to black over a period of days, simply from exposure to the London air. The same logic applied, with slightly less charitable implications, to everything inside a London carriage. The horses had to match. This sounds like a minor vanity, but in 1880 it was a serious social signal. A pair of matched bays, or grays, or chestnuts, trained to identical gaits and comparable heights, demonstrated a level of expenditure and organization that went well beyond simple transportation. Horses were expensive. Good horses were very expensive. Matched horses with the temperament required for urban carriage work, which meant horses that would not bolt at the sound of a steam whistle, would not shy at the approach of a brewery dray, would not panic in the confined chaos of a London intersection, were expensive in a way that was genuinely beyond the reach of anyone who was not either already wealthy or rapidly becoming less so. The staff had to be in full livery. The coachman wore the house colors. The footmen wore the house colors. In more formal establishments, the footmen wore powdered hair, which in 1880 was already an anachronism expensive enough to be taxed, but which was still maintained in the grandest households as a marker of old money and uncompromising tradition. The livery had to fit correctly. It had to be clean. It had to project, from a distance of 50 feet or more, the exact degree of formality appropriate to the occasion. Too casual for a formal call was an error. Too formal for an afternoon drive was also an error, though a different kind. The gradations were real, they were observed, and they were judged. Now add to all of this the London traffic. The traffic of 1880 London was not chaotic in a random way. It was chaotic in a specifically Victorian way, which is to say, it had a kind of order to it that only made the underlying chaos more apparent to anyone paying close attention. There were, nominally, rules of the road. The Highways Act of 1835 required vehicles to keep to the left, and the convention of passing on the right was understood, though not universally observed, and was most aggressively ignored precisely by those most in a hurry, which in London in 1880 was almost everyone. The actual traffic on a major London thoroughfare in the afternoon of a day during the season combined elements that had no natural compatibility with each other, and no mechanism for resolving their conflicts except the sound judgment, which is to say the survival instincts, of a few thousand drivers simultaneously competing for the same space. Your aristocratic carriage might find itself behind a brewery dray loaded with barrels so heavy that the horses were barely moving at a walking pace. It might find itself beside an omnibus from which 30 passengers were attempting to board or alight through a door that opened directly into the path of passing vehicles. It might find itself stalled entirely because a cart had broken a wheel 50 yards ahead, or because a horse had collapsed from overwork or overheating, or because the intersection ahead was so thoroughly blocked by vehicles coming from 4 directions that no one could move until someone with sufficient authority or sufficient volume persuaded enough of the others to back up. Police constables directed traffic at the major crossings, but their authority was moral rather than mechanical. And the cooperation of London's drivers was, depending on the urgency of their business, variable. The result was a traffic experience that was not merely slow, but genuinely unpredictable, in which your coachman had to maintain constant attention, constant communication with the horses through the reins, and constant judgment about when to advance, when to hold back, and when to find an alternative route through the network of narrower streets that crisscross the city behind its main arteries. Those alternative routes were often worse than the main roads. The side streets and courts of 1880 London preserved, behind their Victorian facades, a medieval street pattern that had never been designed for wheeled vehicles of any size. Streets that narrowed to the width of a single carriage at unpredictable points. Courts that ended without exit. Lanes where 2 vehicles meeting from opposite directions had no obvious solution and were forced into a slow, grinding negotiation of inches that could take minutes to resolve and left both coachmen and both sets of horses in states of elevated anxiety. And horses in 1880 were not machinery. They were living animals with living animal responses to the world around them. A horse that had been working in London traffic for several hours had been exposed to a sensory environment of extraordinary intensity. The noise of the granite sets, the noise of other horses, the noise of omnibuses and drays and cabs and pedestrians, the smells of manure and ammonia and coal smoke, and the abattoir smells that drifted from various parts of the city, the visual chaos of advertisements and shop fronts, and the sudden movements of pedestrians stepping off the curb without looking. A horse that had dealt well with all of this for 3 hours might still, without any warning that a human observer could detect, react suddenly to something that triggered a deeper alarm. The technical term for this was bolting, and it was a known and constant hazard of Victorian carriage travel. A bolting horse was not a horse that had done something wrong. It was a horse that had done something extremely right from the horse's perspective, which was to run very fast away from the thing that was frightening it. From the passenger's perspective inside the carriage, the experience began with a lurch and a sudden acceleration that was completely different from normal movement, followed almost immediately by the realization that the coachman's attempts to bring the horses under control had not yet succeeded, and that the carriage was now moving at a speed that bore no relationship to the available stopping distance in any direction. The springs, which had been gently absorbing small road imperfections, were now bouncing through them at a velocity that transmitted every jolt directly and violently to the interior. Carriage accidents of the bolting variety killed people with some regularity in 1880. The accounts from Hyde Park alone, where the aristocracy conducted their most public carriage displays, record horses plunging into the Serpentine, carriages overturning on the gravel drives, riders thrown from their seats on the Row. A contemporary police account describes a horse bolting at Rotten Row and making for Kensington Gardens at full speed, where the animal attempted to jump a 6-foot iron railing, was impaled through the shoulders on the pointed tops, and the lady passenger was thrown clear over the fence and into the gardens. She was, remarkably, not much worse for the fall. The horse had to be destroyed. This was the risk that accompanied every carriage outing in 1880. Not a dramatic or theatrical risk. Not a risk that most journeys would encounter, but a real risk, present in the background of every drive, that could materialize without warning and resolve itself in seconds, in ways that ranged from mildly alarming to fatal. The aristocracy was aware of this. They got into their carriages anyway, every day, because the alternative was to forfeit the social performance that the carriage represented and in 1880, that was simply not a viable option for anyone who wished to remain relevant. Now consider what this carriage was actually costing. The financial obligations of maintaining a private carriage in London in 1880 were substantial enough that the phrase keeping his own carriage was a social indicator of considerable weight. It meant something specific about a person's income, their household organization, and their capacity for sustained expenditure that had no productive return whatsoever. A carriage was pure overhead. It produced nothing. It generated nothing. It was entirely a statement, and it was an extraordinarily expensive statement. The carriage itself might be purchased for anywhere from a few dozen pounds for a modest brougham to several hundred for a well-built landau or barouche of the kind appropriate for fashionable appearances. But the purchase price was only the beginning. A West End carriage hired by the month, including horses, harness, coachman, stabling, and forage, cost around 30 guineas for a one-horse vehicle and 45 guineas for a two-horse establishment per month. For a family that owned its own horses and carriage rather than hiring, the annual costs of stabling, hay, oats, shoeing, the coachman's wages, the footman's wages, the liveries for both, the maintenance of the carriage itself, and the government duty that was levied, with what a contemporary Victorian observed had all the restraint of a greedy Irish beggar. On the carriage, the horses, the coachman's livery, the footman's livery, the powder on the footman's head, and the armorial bearings on the carriage door. All of this combined to produce an annual expenditure that represented a serious portion of even a comfortable aristocratic income. There were taxes on everything. The carriage was taxed. The horses were taxed. The coachman was taxed. His livery was taxed. His powder was taxed. The hammercloth on the box seat was taxed. The armorial bearings were taxed. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, as the same contemporary observer noted with some bitterness, had positioned himself throughout this entire enterprise as an additional and unrequested passenger, holding out his hat at every point where money changed hands. The Victorian state was not, by modern standards, a high-tax state, but it was remarkably creative about the particular category of expenditures involved in maintaining the visual performance of aristocratic status. And that visual performance was non-negotiable. During the London season, which ran roughly from late spring through July, and constituted the annual period during which aristocratic social and political life reached its peak intensity, the daily carriage drive was not a pleasure excursion. It was a professional obligation. Hyde Park's Rotten Row and the adjacent carriage drives were, during the afternoon hours of the season, among the most intensely observed public spaces in the world. To appear there, in your carriage, correctly equipped and correctly dressed, was to participate in a daily demonstration of continued membership in the class that mattered. To not appear was to invite speculation. To appear incorrectly was potentially worse. The rules governing what constituted correct appearance in a carriage in Hyde Park in 1880 were detailed enough to fill several chapters of the etiquette manuals that the Victorian period produced in extraordinary abundance. There were rules about which carriage was appropriate for which occasion: the barouche for formal afternoon drives, the Victoria for a lady driving alone, the brougham for enclosed private journeys. There were rules about who sat where. A gentleman never sat next to a lady who was not a relative. He sat with his back to the horses, facing forward, giving the lady the better seat, facing the direction of travel. He entered the carriage with his back toward the seat to be occupied, taking care not to crush any lady's dress in the process. When the carriage arrived, he alighted first, regardless of whether this required him to pass before the lady, in order to hand her down and ensure she was delivered safely to her destination before he relaxed his care. There were rules about how many calling cards to carry and how they were to be distributed. A married woman calling on another married woman brought her own card and two of her husband's cards, one for the mistress of the house and one for the master. Unmarried daughters could have their names added to the mother's card. A very fine lady would conduct the distribution of calling cards from her carriage, using her footman as an intermediary, who would carry the cards to the door of each house. knock, present them to whoever answered, receive any cards in return, and bring them back. On a busy calling day during the season, this process might be repeated at a dozen or more addresses, each involving the same careful approach to the door, the same footman's knock, the same brief negotiation on the doorstep, while the horses waited and the coachman waited and the traffic moved around all of them in its chaotic permanent flow. And while all of this was happening, the woman inside the carriage was wearing the following. Start with the foundation. The corset of 1880 was a long-bodied construction of silk, cotton, or leather, reinforced with steel boning and equipped with a steel spoon, busk designed to curve snugly over the lower belly. It created the hourglass silhouette that Victorian fashion demanded, the small waist, the rounded bust, the smooth hips. It also, depending on how tightly it was laced, restricted breathing to a degree that made any sustained physical effort extremely challenging. Women of the period who were active in reform movements pointed out, with considerable documentary evidence, that the tight corset impaired digestion, compressed the lower ribs inward over time, and restricted the lung capacity to a fraction of its unlaced capacity. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, argued vigorously that the fashion was both ugly and injurious. Victorian society replied with the particular firmness of a system that has confused its performance requirements with its moral requirements, that women who did not wear their corsets were morally suspect. Over the corset came the combinations, the chemisette, and then the day dress itself, appropriate to the occasion. There was a specific category of dress called the carriage toilette, defined in the etiquette manuals as suitable for afternoon driving or visiting. It was distinct from the morning dress, the walking costume, the visiting dress, the dinner dress, the ball gown, and the various other categories that a woman of respectable station was expected to be able to deploy correctly for each occasion. Getting the category wrong was a social error. The carriage toilette for a fashionable afternoon in Hyde Park in 1880 would have been constructed with the bustle silhouette then fashionable, a high-fitted collar, long tight sleeves, and floor-length skirts of a sufficient weight and volume that simply moving through a confined space required practice and coordination that most modern people have never needed. Over this came the gloves. Gloves were mandatory. A lady never appeared in public with bare hands, ever. Over this came the appropriate headpiece, because a hat was mandatory too, though the particular form of hat varied by the occasion and the degree to which fashion and practicality intersected, which in 1880 was not to a remarkable degree. Over the hat came the possibility of a veil, depending on the weather and the degree of protection from the London air that was deemed necessary or desirable. That London air was important, because inside the carriage, with the windows closed, you were sitting in a sealed enclosure that was not airtight, but was not far from it, and that enclosure was moving through an outdoor environment containing concentrations of coal smoke, horse ammonia, road dust, and the general atmospheric residue of a city of 5 million people that no amount of carriage-making craftsmanship could entirely exclude. The fine soot that settled on everything in London settled inside carriages too. The smell of the streets, which was omnipresent, found its way through the ventilation gaps and the imperfect sealing of windows and doors, and presented itself at reduced but not negligible intensity to the passengers inside. A respectable person in 1880 London, contemporary writers noted, had to wash their face and hands several times during the day simply to maintain a half-decent appearance. The soot that the city's coal fires released into the air settled on skin, on hair, on fabrics, on everything. The carriage provided protection from the worst of this, but it did not provide immunity. An afternoon spent in carriage calls and park appearances in London in 1880 left evidence on the skin and clothing of its participants that required attention before the evening's engagements could begin. And the evening's engagements required the carriage again. Evening use of the carriage introduced an additional set of complications. Ball work, as the carriage trade called it, was the most logistically demanding of all carriage duties. and the one that most dramatically illustrated the gap between the image of aristocratic life and its operational reality. When a grand family attended a ball at a house some distance from their own, the carriage brought them to the door. The footman descended and lowered the step and opened the door and handed the ladies out and accompanied them up the stairs to the entrance. The carriage then had to wait. It could not go home and return, not necessarily, because the end time of the ball was not precisely known, and the carriage had to be available when the family wished to leave. This meant that the coachman, in his full livery, sat on his box in whatever the night was providing. In summer, this might be merely cool and damp. In winter, it might be genuinely dangerous. The horses, standing in their harness, required management. They had to be kept warm, kept calm, kept as comfortable as possible, while their principals were inside a ballroom for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. The footmen were responsible for keeping an eye on the horses and the carriage, which meant that they too spent those hours in the cold or the damp, in their livery, waiting. The hosts of fashionable London balls were aware of this and sometimes provided covered areas for waiting carriages or arrangements with nearby stables. In other cases, the coachman simply waited in the street, in the long rows of carriages that accumulated outside the most popular addresses during the season. A river of patient horses and waiting servants stretched around the block in the dark, while inside the house above them, people in magnificent clothes danced and talked and ate and pretended that nothing about this was complicated. The ball ended. The master of ceremonies at the door called out for carriages in order. The footman summoned the family's carriage from wherever it had positioned itself in the queue. The family emerged. The return journey home, through streets emptied of daytime traffic, but still bearing all the physical characteristics of the day's passage, began. And then, somewhere between Mayfair and Belgravia, or between Belgrave Square and South Kensington, or wherever the route happened to take them, the road surface changed, or a stone shifted under a wheel, or the horses started and the carriage lurched. The passenger composed her face. The passenger straightened her spine within her corset. The passenger said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because this was simply what carriage travel was, and what it had always been, and what the whole elaborate performance of aristocratic civilization required everyone to treat as entirely normal. But here is what is worth sitting with for a moment. Here is the question that the whole elaborate theater of Victorian carriage-going eventually forces you to ask. Why did they do it? Not rhetorically, genuinely. Why did the aristocracy of 1880 London persist in maintaining an entire system of transportation, social performance, and daily expenditure that was expensive, uncomfortable, unreliable, occasionally dangerous, and conducted through streets that were, by the honest admission of the people who lived in them, covered in a layer of filth that only the most disciplined social fiction could transform into the backdrop for civilized life? The answer is that they did it because the system itself depended on them doing it. Victorian aristocratic society was a machine for the production and maintenance of hierarchy, and the carriage was one of its primary mechanisms. Without the visible display of the carriage and its equipment, the hierarchy became difficult to read. Without the hierarchy being readable, the entire system of social organization, which allocated prestige, influence, marriage prospects, political access, and countless forms of informal power according to who stood where in a chain of precedence that stretched from the queen down through the nobility and gentry to the upper professional classes, and then stopped abruptly with everyone below them, became uncertain. And a system that is uncertain about its own organization is a system in the early stages of something it does not yet have a name for. The Victorians of 1880 were, though they could not yet clearly see it, in the early stages of exactly that something. The railway had already done to long-distance travel what the carriage could not survive, made it faster, cheaper, more reliable, less dependent on weather, and accessible to a social range that the carriage could never accommodate. By 1880, as one contemporary noted, many people used the train to reach their destinations. because a few hours by steam train was far more tolerable than hours in a bouncing, poorly sprung carriage over rough roads. But the wealthy still drove their carriages, not because the carriage was a better way to travel, because the carriage was the right way to demonstrate who they were. This is the deeper nightmare buried inside the everyday inconvenience of the Victorian carriage ride. It is not the mud, it is not the smell, it is not the jolting or the bolting horses, or the impossible traffic, or the relentless expense. It is the recognition, which any sufficiently honest aristocrats of 1880 must at some level have been carrying, that the enormous investment of money and effort and time and discomfort was not finally for transportation at all. It was for the maintenance of a story about who deserved to occupy the center of the world and who did not. And the world was, very slowly, beginning to find that story less persuasive. The automobile would arrive within 20 years, not as a practical vehicle at first. The early motor cars were unreliable, noisy, slow, and the object of parliamentary legislation, specifically the Locomotives on Highways Act, which required any self-propelled vehicle to be preceded by a man walking with a red flag at a speed of no more than 4 miles per hour. This was carriage society defending itself against the thing that would replace it, deploying the full authority of Parliament to insist that the future walk in front of the present and announce itself before it arrived. By 1896, the red flag requirement was removed. By 1900, the motor car was becoming something that wealthy families began to acquire alongside their carriages rather than instead of them. By 1920, the carriage was largely gone, and the mews behind the grand London houses were being converted into garages, and then into the charming residential properties they became in the 20th century. The horses were gone, the coachmen were gone, the footmen in powder were gone. The calling cards delivered on horseback were gone. The elaborate carriage toilette, the matched pairs, the lacquered doors with their painted crests, the whole intricate performance that had organized the visible landscape of English aristocratic life for 2 centuries, was gone. What remained was the houses, many of which are still there, and the street pattern that had been designed around the width of a carriage and never quite redesigned for anything else, and the mews, which are now very expensive. And somewhere in the gap between what Victorian aristocratic life looked like from the outside, the gleaming carriage, the matched horses, the perfect livery, and what it actually felt like from the inside, the jolting, the smell, the expense, the impossible etiquette, the perpetual performance in a city that was slowly deciding the performance no longer meant what it had claimed to mean. Somewhere in that gap is a story about what it costs to maintain a system past the point where the system is sustainable. The carriage was the most beautiful, most expensive, most elaborately maintained performance of hierarchy that England ever produced. It was also, from the inside, on any given afternoon in 1880, navigating a street covered in 1,000 tons of manure per day, a deeply uncomfortable way to travel from one place to another. The aristocrats who rode in it knew this. They would never have said so. The whole point of the thing was to make the difficulty invisible, but the difficulty was there. It was always there, and the gap between what was performed and what was lived, between the gleaming crest on the lacquered door and the churned brown street below the gilded wheels, is exactly the kind of gap that history eventually forces open. In 1880, that gap was still narrow enough to be socially manageable. By 1920, it was a different century.